From the American Experience Storybook, Patrick Henry, Part 2. Mr. Henry, I will never trust to appearances again. If your industry be only half equal to your genius, you will become an honor to your profession. And he signed Patrick Henry's license, though it is said young Henry was at this time so ignorant of the forms of practice that he could not make out a case or present it before the court. Like most young lawyers, he had to wait a good while before he had anything to do, and when it came, it was rather by accident. But it gave him opportunity, and that opportunity made him famous. We will now tell you about his first law case and his first speech. There was at that time in Virginia an established church like they had in England. It was called the Episcopal Church, and the ministers were hired by the governor. Virginia was a great tobacco-raising country, and they had a law that the farmers might pay their debts in tobacco. The sheriff and the judges of the court were paid so much a year in tobacco for their services, and the ministers also received a certain number of pounds of tobacco each year. That seems very funny to us now, but there was once a time in certain parts of the South when they even used coonskins for money. There are many cases where a man even paid for his license when he wanted to get married in coonskins. And when the preacher tied the knot, the young man, if he was generous and liberal, would always load the preacher up with coonskins as payment for his services. This was not generally so, but it was often done in new countries where coons were plentiful and money was scarce. So in Virginia, the farmer could pay his debts in tobacco at 16 shillings a pound. But one year, tobacco went up to 50 shillings a pound. Therefore, the farmers who were in control had a law made that they might pay their debts in money if they wanted to, instead of tobacco. This law was made to hold good for only 10 months, and after that time they again paid in tobacco, the price of which had gone down as low or lower than it had been before. But a few years later there came another short crop in tobacco, and the prices went up to 50 shillings again. So the farmers had another law made permitting them to pay in money, but they very cautiously made this law so that it would not run out. But the ministers seemed not to have noticed that it was so made, and after the first year they wanted their pay in tobacco again, because it would bring them nearly double what they would get if they were paid in money. This brought on quite a war between the people and the ministers, and they had a big suit in court. The farmers were very mad with the clergymen, and the clergymen were very mad with the farmers, each accusing the other of wanting to cheat them. The clergymen sent word to the King of England, and the king took their side and said that the farmers' law should be null and void, which means that it should not be enforced, and that the clergymen should be paid in tobacco. The king was very wise in this, and while it appeared that he only wanted to make the ministers part, he was in reality planning to enrich himself. Because if the clergymen could collect their debts from the people in tobacco, which was worth more than twice as much as the money they were entitled to, the king said he would also collect his taxes in tobacco. So you see how wise and yet how mean the king was in his decision. The people had the law on their side, and the clergymen wanted to collect twice what the people owed them, and the king said that they should do it. The clergymen made a great noise that the people were swindling them out of their just rights. They wanted tobacco. They did not want money. They argued that it was a shame and a disgrace to swindle the ministers in that way, and insisted that they were right because the king himself said so. The people, on the other hand, said the ministers and officers were employed for so much a year, and that they had no right to demand their tobacco, which they could sell for 2 or 3 times as many pounds of money as they had engaged to work for. This looked entirely reasonable, and the people were right, but the clergymen and the officers and the king wanted tobacco. You would think that it would have been better if the sheriff and the king and the judges had brought suit against the people to collect their claims in tobacco. But you will see how cunning they were in having the ministers do it instead of doing it themselves. All the people loved the ministers, and they would sympathize with their cause perhaps, when they would not sympathize with the officers. Therefore, it was decided that the ministers should bring suit, and if they could make the people pay them in tobacco, then they would have to pay the officers and the king also in tobacco. A lawyer by the name of Lewis was to plead the case of the people, and Mr. Lyons was to plead the case of the clergymen. But when the king decided that the clergymen were right and the people were wrong and the law should not be obeyed, Mr. Lewis, the people's lawyer, told him they could not gain their cause against the king, and so he gave up. There were very few lawyers in the country, and they were nearly all in the employ of the king, so the people could find no one to plead their case. And, as the last resort, they turned to Patrick Henry, a young lawyer of 25 years who had never made a speech in his life. The place where the case was to be tried was at Hanover Courthouse, and the judge who was to sit on the bench was Patrick Henry's own father, and among those who opposed the people was his own uncle for whom he was named, the Reverend Patrick Henry. Was this not an embarrassing situation for the young lawyer who had never made a speech? The day came. It was not one of those beautiful Indian summer days which comes in November in the South. Patrick Henry was early at the courthouse, and great throngs of people gathered from all directions. Never before in Hanover had there been so many farmers present on any court day. The decision of the case amounted to thousands of dollars of loss or gain to them. The clergymen came from all over the state, which was then, only a colony, though much larger than it is now. There were 20 or more of the most learned clergymen of the nation present. They had come to frown upon the young lawyer who was to plead against them and to scowl at the people who they pretended were trying to rob them. Patrick Henry was nervous. It was his first case. He had never spoken in court, and he walked restlessly about among the farmers, speaking a word here and there to this or that one, with many of them pulling at his elbows, offering him advice. He could plainly see that they were afraid they had a very poor lawyer, and he felt himself that they had. Presently he saw his learned and eloquent uncle, Reverend Patrick Henry, drive up in his carriage, and before any of the clergymen could get to him, the young lawyer dashed up, grasped his uncle by the hand, and pleaded with him to go away. The young lawyer said, "Sir, I have never spoken in my life, and your presence here will add to my embarrassment. My own father must sit on the bench, and that will be bad enough. Besides, there will be 20 clergymen to criticize me. All this I can stand, but I am sure I could not have my own uncle, whose name I bear, sitting among them frowning upon me. For my sake, I beg you to go away." The uncle replied in a kindly but regretful tones, "Patrick, I'm surprised to find you arrayed against the ministry. You are doing yourself great injustice and ruining your future prospects for usefulness." "That may be," said Patrick, "but I see no moral reason why I should not accept the case for the people. Besides, in my own heart, I am firmly convinced that they are right, and with all due respect, sir, that you and the clergy are wrong. For my sake and the respect I bear you, will you not go away? I shall have to say some hard words against the clergy this day, and I would not want to speak them in your ears." There was respectfulness in his tones that his uncle could but appreciate, and an earnestness in his manner which he could not resist. So, re-entering his carriage, he simply said, "For your sake, Patrick, I will be absent, though your cause is wrong. I have too much respect for your feelings to allow my presence to embarrass you." So saying, he drove away. The court was opened. The array before Patrick's eyes was almost fearful. The most learned men of the colony, the severest critics in the New World, were against him, and the courthouse was crowded. On the outside, the windows were thronged with anxious faces looking in. Mr. Lyons made a short speech, simply explaining to the jury the fact that the king had decreed his side to be right. He pleaded that the clergy were the greatest benefactors of the colony, that it was a shame to mistreat them, and that this law, if enforced, simply robbed them of their just allowance. His closing was eloquent and beautiful, and the ministers nodded their assent when he took his seat. He had presented his cause well. Now came the first trial of Patrick Henry's strength. No one had ever heard him speak, and everyone was curious. Even his opponents seemed sorry for him. He rose and stood for a moment in an awkward manner, and when he began, faltered much in his speech. The people hung their heads, and the ministers exchanged sly, smiling looks of derision at each other. His father, it is said, almost sunk behind the desk. He was so mortified and confused. But these circumstances only lasted for a few moments. Patrick Henry's soul rose within him. His whole appearance changed. The fire of his eloquence was kindled, and he seemed to forget himself. His figure stood erect, his bearing was lofty, and his face shone with a grandeur which no one had ever seen upon it before. His awkward actions became graceful to behold. His voice, no longer faltering, was charming and beautiful. Words seemed to crowd for utterance. There was lightning in his eyes as he turned upon the clergymen that seemed to rive them like a thunderbolt. He literally made their blood run cold and their hair rise on ends. All eyes were now fastened upon him. Men looked at each other with surprise, and then, held by the spell of his eyes, the majesty of his attitude, and the power of his words, they could look away no more. The old father stood erect behind the desk, with tears of delight streaming down his cheeks. The jury seemed bewildered. No one can describe that speech, and it has never been printed. It was delivered upon the impulse of the moment, but it was declared by the clergymen themselves, against whom it was spoken, that no such speech as they believed had ever fallen from the lips of man to this day in Hanover, Virginia. The highest compliment that can be paid to a speaker is to say, he is almost equal to Patrick Henry when he pled against the parsons. The clergymen had sued for heavy damages, but the jury, without scarcely leaving their seats, granted them only 1 penny. Mr. Lyons made a motion for a new trial. That is, he tried to get his case tried over. But the court refused to give them a new hearing. Was ever such a victory won by a new lawyer? It was the first speech Patrick Henry ever made, and it was undoubtedly one of the greatest speeches ever delivered in the world before a court. At its close, the people, who had hung their heads in shame at the beginning, rushed into the courthouse, seized the young lawyer in spite of the sheriff's cries for order, hoisted him on their shoulders, carried him out of the house and over the town, with a wild multitude following and screaming his praises at the top of their voices. Patrick Henry had at last found the calling for which he was intended, and to which he was suited. From this time forward, he was the greatest lawyer, not only in Hanover Courthouse, but in all of Virginia. He had all the cases he could attend to and made plenty of money to support his family, who had for many years been struggling with poverty. He lived for nearly 40 years after this Memorial Day at the Hanover Courthouse. His life was full of honor and usefulness to his country, and he has made several other speeches, parts of which almost every schoolboy has at one time or another used as a declamation. And now that we have told you of the hardships and troubles of Patrick Henry's early life, let us tell you of the greatest thing he did in the service of his country. In January 1765, the famous Stamp Act was passed by the British Parliament. The colonists were to be oppressed, and no one dared to openly rebel against it. In May, Patrick Henry was elected to the House of Burgesses. That is what the Virginia legislature was called in those days. And he pledged himself to his people to do all he could to oppose it. There were many learned and eloquent speakers in the House, and he was not expected to take the lead. The fine gentlemen in the assembly who lived in fine old Virginia mansions and wore fine clothes made fun of Patrick's country way of talking, his homespun clothes, and his awkward manners. But when he spoke, they could not help admiring his wonderful command of language and his power over men. His first speech was against Richmond, who wanted to lend the colonies moneys to themselves and their friends. This made them his great enemies, but the other side, the common people, admired him more than ever. At last, it came time to consider the hated Stamp Act. None of the great men dared to speak against it openly. So Patrick Henry drew up some resolutions declaring that the English Parliament had no right to make this tax upon the people, and furthermore, they had no right to make any laws against the interest of the colonies. He said they were responsible to the king alone, and that the House of Burgesses and the governor alone had the right to make the colonists pay taxes. After the reading of his resolutions, Patrick Henry was assailed with a storm of words and much ridicule by those who favored or were afraid of England. There were hot speeches from several gentlemen, and a less heroic spirit than Henry's would have said not a word more. No one thought the resolutions would pass. At length, when the storm had subsided, Patrick Henry arose to speak. His face was deathly pale. His thin lips quivered, but his eyes had a look of awful determination in them. Stretching his long arms at full length toward the president, called the speaker, he began and delivered the greatest speech ever heard in America. The walls rang with the mighty force of his words, and everyone was overpowered with his wonderful eloquence, as they had been in the famous Parson case. They shouted treason at him, but he could not be frightened, but all the time grew bolder and more eloquent. When he closed this great speech, every member but two voted for his resolutions. Patrick Henry had been the first one who dared oppose England. His wonderful speech was printed and sent all over the colonies, north and south, and was even sent to England. And in a few months, Parliament repealed, that is, removed, the hated Stamp Act. But the spirit of liberty was now awake in the people, and they demanded relief from other unjust laws which England tried to impose. And in this effort, Patrick Henry was one of the foremost men in the country. He was greater than all the other men in Virginia, and he, with Thomas Jefferson and Richard Henry Lee, kept telling the people they ought to be free. Well, if you haven't done it already, reach down, click like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. We'll continue with Molly Pitcher in the next video. Thanks so much for watching. I love you guys. As Tigger says, ta-ta for now.